How to make invisible seams on your puppet.
To the puppet nerds of the world, this may sound absurd, but this is the place you need to be. We'll do an interview and then we'll stitch and glue all of the dolls, we'll make it shake. If you wanna be in the know and to play like a pro, subscribe to Puppet Nerd.
Welcome back, Puppet Nerds. Adam Krutinger here, and today we're going to learn how to hide the seams on your puppet. Now, if you look at the Muppets or any television-style puppets, you'll notice that they don't really have any seams on them. This is important because this is part of what helps make them feel alive. Most living things don't have seams on them. Having no seams makes it look less like something that was made, more like something that might actually be alive. And it also keeps it from looking like a store-bought toy puppet. Now, when it comes to hiding seams, there's three main components that go into it. Number one is the fabric choice. Now, it's very easy to hide seams in a fur character, like a monster or some sort of animal that you're making. Because the fur has such a long pile, it'll almost completely cover up any seams that you make on your character. But on fleece-covered characters, it can be a little bit trickier because the pile is so short. In fact, the pile is so short that most people don't probably even think of it as having a pile. And of course, there are all kinds of different types of fleeces that you can use to make your puppet. But there are some standard fleeces that have been used in the puppet building world for a long time. If you check out in the links below, there's an article on the history of puppet fleece, and another on some of the best places to order fleece for your puppet building needs. So that's the first component. The second component is the stitching. Now, people use a whole bunch of different types of stitches for a puppet, but there are some that work better than others for different reasons. If you click right here, you can check out the video I made on the best stitches to use for building a puppet. It shows two of the most popular stitches and really the best places where to use them on your puppet. The stitching is really important because if you stitch well enough and use the right fabric, you might not have to really do any seam picking at all to make your seams invisible. Those are two components that help a lot. But the last component is doing some grooming and treatment to your fleece after it's stitched together and your puppet is finished. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me show you this little guy that I'm building now. This is a blank puppet that I just started building, so it has no features or anything yet. I just finished stitching it and have not touched any of the seams yet. But like I pointed out, through using a good fabric choice and doing good stitching, already the seam line that goes right down the middle of this puppet is already practically invisible. Though it could still use a little bit of a tune-up. But particularly where you can see the seams on this puppet is on the hands. So these are the seams that you can see on the side of the arms and on the hands. These are really kind of heavy seams because I stitched this on the sewing machine. Compare this to the seam right here going down the middle of the body. It's a bit more hidden, and you can tell that this was done by hand. Even though those seams on the hands were stitched by machine, I can still make them practically invisible by doing a little bit of treatment on them. In the industry, we mostly refer to this as picking the seams. Though that is the lingo, I want to give you a small amount of warning on that. And what that is the most common mistake that I see when people pick the seams is they overpick the seams. And when you overpick the seams, you're not really doing yourself any favors. So picking the seams is taking a pin like this and very carefully dragging it over the seam to try to get some of that little pile out of there. Those little fibers that are kind of seem like they're growing out of the fleece, and kind of stir them up and pull them out of that seam. In the process of being sewn, they get pinched together between that seam, and what you really want to do is kind of pluck them out carefully and keep them from getting stuck in there. But like I said, some people take that too far. They use the pin almost like a shovel and dig it in there and start pulling those little fibers up. But what happens is you might not see that seam anymore, but what instead you see is where the seam was. So instead of a valley, you have kind of like a hill. So even though you don't see a seam anymore, you still see a distracting line on your puppet where the seam was. And I found a kind of fun way to demonstrate it with this little Zen garden. So this little Zen garden is like a little box of sand. So watch this. If I take this and I'm going to draw a line right down the middle here, you can essentially see that little valley that is created. And think of that valley as the seam. There's two different pieces of fabric brought together. And what you really want to do to get rid of that seam is to be able to gently comb it over to get it flat, to make it seem like that seam was never even there at all. Okay? That's what you want. You want to make that seam completely vanish. However, this is the mistake people make. If I make that seam again, what people kind of accidentally seem to do is they rake it up a lot. And instead of having one valley there, they kind of have a big mound right where that seam was. So, you know, given, like I said, you don't see that valley anymore, but instead what you see is that big mound. But since the point of this is to make this character look like something that wasn't made, having a mound doesn't make it seem like a character that was alive. So it is crucial to have a gentle touch when picking the seams on your puppet. So right now I'm going to show you the technique that I use, and after that I'll show you a couple other techniques that I've seen other people use as well. Now let's take a look at some of these sewing samples. This first one here was stitched on a sewing machine, and you can see it has the most harsh seam on all these examples. You can also tell because of the seam allowance on the inside. This one here was stitched with a slip stitch, also known as a ladder stitch, and it does a little bit better of a job hiding the seams without any treatment. However, it also has a little bit of that seam allowance on the inside because of the nature of stitching it from the outside, but doesn't look too bad. However, it's not a very strong stitch, which if you look at that video I mentioned earlier, it kind of demonstrates that. And this one here is the whip stitch. And it's a very flat seam on the back, and you can tell even without any picking or treatment, it's practically hidden already, although there's still a little bit more you can do to make these seams look even more invisible. Now I'm going to show you a simple way to make these seams kind of disappear, or at least be way less noticeable. After I show you this quick technique, I'll also show you a couple more techniques that I've seen other people do and I occasionally use once in a while. I'm going to start off with the one on the sewing machine, the one with the most harsh seam of them all. And the basic thing that I do is use a sewing pin like this. And all I really do is take that pin and I kind of hold it at an angle. You don't want to hold it perfectly up and down and be poking it. You want to hold it at an angle like this and carefully comb over the seam just like this. And you can already tell in this spot right here, the seam is getting a little bit fuzzier and almost starting to blend in. Now the common mistake that I mentioned before is that you don't want that mound to show up. And how you get the mound is I've seen people in the past, they kind of put the needle in and pluck up at the strands. That does a little bit too much. Kind of like we did in that little Zen garden, you really just kind of want to comb over it gently. And I find using a single pin and gently going back and forth over that seam really can make that seam start to disappear and kind of vanish. I mostly go along the seam like this, but once in a while I'll kind of comb it to the side a little bit too. Kind of whatever really makes it seem to vanish and come away. You really don't want to do it too hard. You want to do it just enough until it really starts to seem like it vanishes. And you might not get it to go away completely. It's better to underdo it than to overdo it because it'll naturally start to go away a little bit just in the wear and tear of being handled and touched and used for performances. So I only did the bottom half, but you can tell, you know, compare this half here to that half there. It's definitely an improvement. The next one here is the piece that was done using the ladder stitch or slip stitch, and the technique is exactly the same. But I should have to do a little bit less work since, again, the seam already is a little bit less noticeable. But I'll actually do the whole thing this time. And I'll just very carefully go over that seam just like this. Start to bring it all together. And you can tell comparing these two, it already looks a bit better. The last piece here is the one that was done with the whip stitch, and as I said before, with this stitch it really seems to kind of vanish even without any treatment at all. However, I still like to gently comb over the seams just like this. One thing I forgot to mention, and this goes with all of them, if you do find that you accidentally did overpick your seams and it's starting to get a little bit of a pile there, one thing you can do is carefully take scissors and even very, very carefully, you don't want to do too much, you can kind of trim some of it back just a little bit. It's not a bad thing to do if you find that you have too many pieces that are sticking out a little bit. That can make it look much better too. And I would say that seam is practically invisible. I know my lighting's a little goofy here, but that looks pretty good to my eye. Now I went back and picked all those seams a little bit more. I'm going to lay these out in a different order and see if we can kind of tell which one is which. Now here they are, the same 3 samples. They're in a different order though, but just by looking at them, I think I can tell pretty quickly which one is which. They all look pretty good, and especially with the puppet in motion and with the other features on it, they kind of help hide the seams too. Most people would barely notice any of these seams at all. But off the bat, I can tell this first one here is the one with the whip stitch. And we can double check it right there. This is the whip stitch one with a little bit of a seam treatment. This one here is the piece that was stitched on the sewing machine. You can see that seam allowance edge right there. And then lastly, we have the piece that was done with the ladder stitch. And again, they all look pretty good as far as the seams are concerned. Now these samples were done using the nylon loop fleece, but the same applies to any of the puppet fleeces that you might use. Now here's a couple of the other tricks that I've seen for picking the seams on your puppets. And the first one is to use the hook side of some Velcro. So if you use the hook side of Velcro, it literally has all those little hooks, which do a pretty decent job agitating the fleece. And what you just do is just carefully can run it over it like this. This works better with the other nylon fleeces. It seems to be a little bit too intense on the loop fleece, and the reason for that is loop fleece is literally the loop side of hook and loop fabric. These pieces together stick perfectly because that's how they're made to work. But if you have a very gentle hand, it still works pretty well on your seams, though it can be a little bit too intense as far as I'm concerned. But even if I have a piece here, this here is some 12-ounce nylon fleece, and it works a little bit better on this. Really just combing out that fleece, just like this. All those teeth literally act as a little comb for your puppet fleece. And it can do a really nice job on combing this out and making your seams invisible. The next one is the same as the pins, except for it's a much better handle on it. A lot of people complain that these pins are kind of hard to hold because they're so small and skinny. Even with the ball end there, it can be kind of tedious to hold, especially if you're picking seams for a long time. So here's something that I see people do. They take an X-Acto blade like this, and what they do is they take the blade out like this, and then they take their pin, take some clippers here, clip the ball off, and then what you can do is put your pin inside of this, and now you have a very comfortable little handle here for picking your seams. So if I come back here, this is much more comfortable, especially if you're doing this for hours while you're watching TV, if you just made like a whole set of puppets for Avenue Q or for some other production. This is a really great way to do it. The thing that I don't love about this, although again I do use this if I have to do it for hours and hours, is I feel like it just gives me a little bit too tough of a handle on it. The one thing I love about just using the pin is that it's kind of hard to put too much pressure on because of the small amount of leverage you have. This gives you a lot more leverage, so you almost have a little bit too much control. But then again, there's pros and cons to both of them. Now the last one I'm going to show you is pretty much the same as the previous one, but adding a couple more pins. So I just cut off the tips of 2 more pins and stuck them in there, so now I have this little comb of like 3 pins on this tool. And it kind of essentially lets you do 3 times as much of the seam combing than you otherwise would have been able to do. And again, one thing I don't like about this is, it just gives me like not enough of a focal point to focus on. I kind of like having the one needle and being able to really control where I'm doing it. But then again, if you're doing a ton of this for hours and hours, it can make you go a little faster, especially if you did a really good job sewing. There's not going to need that much picking anyway. So those were some tips for picking the seams on your puppets. But again, as a reminder, there's no amount of seam picking that will make up for bad sewing. The best way to learn on how to make better seams is to practice your sewing and become a better stitcher. And of course, using high quality fabrics like the ones mentioned on the blog. If you use any other techniques, be sure to mention them down in the comments below. I'd love to see them. And also be sure to mention any other techniques you might want to learn. If you enjoyed this video, I have hundreds of videos right here on the Puppet Nerd channel on how to make puppets and other puppet building techniques. And there's always more information at puppetnerd.com, and that's also where you can download all of my free patterns on how to make your own puppet. Anyway, that's it for now. We'll see you next time.